Comedy is subjective, and while a lot of humor broadly overlaps, what I find funny or not will likely not completely align with your tastes. That being said, there are rules to comedy of all forms. As I've tried to make clear a few times on this channel, different styles of comedy follow unique flows and structures in order to ensure a joke actually lands. While you can break these rules from time to time, to say that these rule breaks mean that comedy has no rules is simply false. However, there's this one genre that keeps trying over and over to make comedy spoofs, parodies, or subversions of itself and just never seems to get it right. Isekai. I swear Konosuba nailed it, and then everyone else tried with little to near negative success, including Konosuba's creator. I actually already made a whole video about series that people said came close, and how all three fall short if you're curious as to what I mean. And actually, while working on the script, I did find another isekai that I thought was pretty funny. This Ultimate Next Gen Full Dive RPG is even shittier than real life, so if you haven't seen that one, I do actually recommend it. It's actually pretty good, pretty funny, at least from most of what I watched. Alright, back to scripted Steve. What's the deal? It can't be that hard, right? Well, obviously we wouldn't be here talking about it if it wasn't that hard. Thus, let's take a walk down fantasy lane and figure out why so many isekai comedies aren't funny. Before we get into the thick of it, allow me to give you a bit of a rundown of how this video is going to work. We've got 4 main topics to discuss, and in each one I'll be explaining an element of comedy that isekai tends to struggle with. I'll use examples of how each point is used successfully, usually by Konosuba, because I already said that's one of the only successful attempts, and how other isekai fall short in this aspect. Additionally, I'm going to show pieces of a short story I wrote, and then immediately kill all comedy in it by overly explaining the joke, because if I'm gonna dissect and murder a joke, might as well have the courtesy of putting my own on the chopping block. If you want to read it in advance, I'll have a link to the full story down below, as well as a version that is cut up per section. Otherwise, please enjoy the amazing vocal stylings of Jackass Boy and Core of their respective channels and Spilling the Milk. I'd also like to clarify what shows count for what we're talking about. I do not mean any isekai that attempts to simply have jokes in it. This video is focused on the isekai that try to be a comedy first and foremost. In Another World with My Smartphone, Do You Love Your Mom and Her 2-Hit Multi-Target Attacks, Cautious Hero, etc. If the main focus of the series is to make light of or parody the isekai genre, then it counts for our purposes. And by no means am I saying that these shows don't have any good jokes in them. Most of them got at least 1 or 2 chuckles out of me, but rather this is a holistic look at the shows and why they're not as memorable or long-lasting as Konosuba has been. The reason I'm also focusing mainly on anime is simply because that's what the widest audience is likely to encounter. I'm sure there are plenty of genuinely funny and good isekai comedy web novels out there, and I'd love to read them. But since most people won't have the time to look for these, or read them if they're not fluent in Japanese, we'll have to treat these shows like most anime fans do, and assume that these are the best that the genre has to offer, regardless of whether or not that's true. As for why I'm qualified to talk about any of this, I've actually written and published online several of my own works, including several comedies. Thus, I think it's safe to say that I at least partially understand the situation. The only difference is that people in the West don't get cartoons made of their web novels. Finally, if you're a longtime fan, you may know that I've already talked about Konosuba's writing, and you may be wondering how this video differs from that one. Well, in the old video I discussed how Konosuba works in the genre of the unapologetic comedy, akin to your Seinfelds or your Always Sunnies. I discussed how its episode structures and writing emulated these sitcoms and stood out among its comedic anime peers for it. Here we're going to do the same thing, but with Konosuba's other half genre. We'll discuss what makes it work as a spoof of the isekai genre, and how it was able to rise to popularity by mocking a rapidly saturating genre of wish fulfillment power trips and generic video game-esque fantasy worlds. The first and arguably most important step in writing a comedic take on a genre is understanding its tropes and subverting them, playing with viewers' expectations of how scenes are supposed to play out. Spaceballs does not work without Star Wars. Austin Powers isn't funny without James Bond being so ubiquitous. Konosuba isn't funny without all the isekai that came before it, giving it all the points to mock. If you've watched or read enough anime discourse, you're probably exhausted by the mere mention of the word subversion, but I feel like it's important to clarify what it means, at least in relation to comedy, as it will help me better highlight how many of these isekai comedies don't understand the concept at all. For an example of typical genre subversion, we can look at Mother Spaceman's video, Too Many Isekai. In this video, he posits at what point do we officially claim that the isekai genre has become too oversaturated in the realm of anime. While the question is mainly kept open-ended, Jeff concludes by saying that as long as a show adds at least one interesting detail to make it truly unique, interesting being the key word there, then it has at least some worth, even in an anime season with 6 isekai in it. While this element is actually relevant to what we're discussing here, the part that's more useful in this moment is the core segment where he goes through several isekai that aired during the season of fall 2019 and discusses how each one subverts the isekai genre in a general sense to either supplement their stories or allow for the inclusion of other genres, i.e. Average Skill's inclusion of the moe club genre or Bookworm subversion through making its main character frail and young so she has to rebuild herself in an average poor family instead of the overpowered abilities or privilege often given to isekai protagonists. In these genre-wide instances, not much actually needs to be changed in order for it to be considered a subversion. We could change, add, or subtract just a few things from the isekai genre's defining tropes to allow it to be explored from a different lens. Subversion in comedy, however, does not mean just changing or adding one detail and calling it a day. Subversion here is taking the concept at hand and using its framework as a jumping off point before completely warping it or flipping it on its head for comedic effect. What's funny is the unexpected outcome, not the trope itself. Thankfully, many of these isekai parodies use one trope in particular that can really help us drive this point home: the reincarnation. The most common way this trope plays out is as such. Our main character dies, typically being run over, or is summoned to a room where they meet a god/goddess. Said deity informs them of what's going on and offers them some sort of magical power or item before sending them on to their isekai adventure. Alright, now how can we subvert this instead of just change it? There are two ways we could do this: either recontextualize the elements of the scene, or the scene as a whole to play off the viewer's expectations. For an example of the first method, we can look back at Konosuba. In the first episode, you can see that the broad structure of the trope is kept the same. Kazuma dies, appears in a room with a goddess, she informs him of what's happening and offers a power or item, and he ends up in another world. What is subverted here is how each part of this trope plays out. Kazuma's death is revealed to not be the stereotypical truck hit, but rather from shock due to his own assumptions, and everyone is now laughing at his corpse. The goddess Aqua is revealed to actually be selfish and annoyed by her job and uses Kazuma's death to blow off some steam by mocking him. After offering Kazuma his choice of overpowered weapons, her own attitude bites her on the overly exposed ass when he decides to take her with him to the other world. The two are then sent with Aqua kicking and screaming and Kazuma cackling just to drive home that these two are no heroes akin to your normal isekai. Each point that an isekai fan would know and recognize is flipped on its head and mocked to the point of feeling very different from the outline that the show still took from. In contrast, what we more typically see is the exact reincarnation setup used, but with one or two aspects changed, with the show nudging you and saying, "It's funny now, right? Right? It's funny. There's a joke now. Huh?" In another world with my smartphone tries this by having the main character meet God, get lots of powers, and then to try to make it funny, having Toya ask to keep his phone with him, and that's it. Do You Love Your Mom does the MMO equivalent of this trope and only changes it by giving the protagonist one overpowered weapon, while his mom grabs two more powerful ones. But I think the most egregious example I can give is the one I'm holding in my hands. True Steve Sakai heads will remember Pizza Kai. The hero and his elf bride open a pizza parlor in another world, opens with almost exactly the typical reincarnation trope, only it tries to pass off changing the typical truck to a pizza delivery bike. This could work, except that the following scene where the protagonist meets the goddess proves that that death is completely irrelevant to the rest of the plot. as he's also given 2 other options for his reincarnation other than pizza chef. And is only changed to say, you get it? It's pizza, like in the title of the book. The only reason he becomes a pizza chef is because the other 2 are taken first by other people when he was never made aware that people were picking between the same 3 choices. None of these examples are attempting to rewrite or play with the formula. They're all just relying on adding one joke and praying that it'll carry them for the rest of the plot. This is how you end up with the one gimmick critique that many lob at this genre. If you've only got one joke at the start, I can't believe you'll have too many more down the line. As for the other method of recontextualizing the scene as a whole, I'm going to use my own example. So here you go.
I feel like shit.
Eddie sat up from his prone position, flitting and squeezing shut his eyelids against the blinding light of morning. When he finally adjusted to the brightness, all his bodily worries were overtaken by location-based fears. Based on the snoring filling the air, Eddie didn't even need to look over as he slapped his best friend awake.
Dan, wake up. I think we ended up in a Ren fair again.
What? Stop hitting me!
The groggy Dan pushed himself up from the stack of hay the 2 men found themselves resting on. All around them were stone buildings and cobblestone paths. The men and women were dressed in simple clothes that neither of them could name but knew was medieval. Horses trotted along, and the most modern thing that they could see were street lamps. Then again, neither Eddie nor Dan were historians, so who could really tell?
I don't think this is a Ren fair. It's too big and management hasn't come to kick us out yet.
Eddie looked over at Dan, who seemed to be taking their predicament quite well.
So where are we? A cult town? Amish village?
Dan shrugged.
No clue, though Amish village would be a new one for us.
Eddie clenched his jaw and took a deep breath.
Let's try and retrace our steps from last night. First, we got drunk.
Then we went and got sandwiches from that sketchy deli with the pet rat.
Then we spent turns vomiting up sandwiches.
After that, we died and met a goddess.
Then we woke up here.
Eddie stopped and stared at Dan with a look of incredulity.
Can you say that last one again?
The rat deli or the goddess one?
Dan asked in complete sincerity.
Which one do you think I mean?
Eddie yelled, causing several passerbys to stop and look at the 2 a little longer than they all had been. Eddie waved an apology to them before turning his attention back to Dan and asking in a hushed tone,
What do you mean we died and met a goddess? Did you do mushrooms or something last night?
Dan shook his head.
I'm gonna be real. I totally forgot it until we were going back through everything, but yeah. The food poisoning actually killed both of us, and we appeared in front of a very hot goddess or angel or something. You really don't remember that?
No, I think I'd remember any one of those things.
Eddie finally got up from their stack of hay and began flailing his arms, fully ignoring the increasing amount of eyes on him. Dan followed Eddie to his feet and slapped his panicking friend.
Chill. Dude, we just got Isekai'd. It's not that big a deal.
What is that supposed to mean?
Dan gave him a disappointed look.
Isekai'd? We died and went to another world, probably one filled with magic and shit?
Eddie restrained the impulse to punch the idiot standing in front of him.
I know what an isekai is. We watch all the same shows. I'm talking about the fact that you're not panicking that we've been teleported to a world where we can't even shit in a toilet.
Dude.
Dan grabbed Eddie and pulled him into a nearby alley.
This is what every nerd dreams of. We're in a universe of swords and sorcery. A world with dungeons and maybe dragons. A land of might and magic. And we gotta see a really hot goddess.
No, Dan. You got to see a really hot goddess.
Eddie was too furious to even find the right things to be angry about. Dan scoffed.
Nah, you definitely saw her. You kept trying to hit on her.
Eddie went silent at hearing Dan's news.
Shit. Was she at least into it?
Oh, absolutely not. You were still pretty drunk, so it was kind of embarrassing.
Dan couldn't help but start to laugh at his friend's increasingly distraught appearance.
You're gonna have a really awkward afterlife, bro.
Eddie leaned against a wall and let himself slide down to his butt.
I don't even remember what she looks like, and I'm still so embarrassed that I want to die. But if I die, I'll probably see her again.
At this realization, he used both hands to rub his face in frustration. As you can see, the trope did play out in mostly the same manner as other isekai. But the joke's in the fact that we didn't see it. Instead, we're put into the position of our two hungover protagonists as they attempt to recall what happened after they had blacked out. We, like Eddie, are only hearing about the apparently very embarrassing ordeal secondhand. Most of what we come to expect about the reincarnation trope is ripped away, and we're left with only our imagination to fill in what possibly could have gone down, thus subverting the entire trope instead of its details like Konosuba did. But one of the big things that these examples have that the average OP power fantasy isekai almost instantly loses is relatability. By having your core setting be a fantasy world, you instantly risk losing one of the most important aspects to almost every form of comedy, being relatable. People won't find something they don't understand funny. Comedy needs to have something for the audience to latch onto and relate to their own experiences. There's a reason that Seinfeld got popular for just saying things that everybody notices and making a show about things that everyone experiences. The clear issue is that we live in the real world and thus cannot relate to what it's like to deal with dragons or magic. Well, what do you do then? You make the characters and the situations relatable. Obviously. Why are these things I have to explain? You know what's not relatable? Being so powerful that you can beat anything in one hit. But that's the next section, so let's focus on other things. Like having a harem, being a hero. I think you get the point. Fantasy isn't realistic and audiences aren't gonna find any jokes related to these things funny. It's like trying to do a stand-up set of only in-jokes. Or if you're like me, and you make unnecessarily long videos about why shows aren't funny, having people like you. Thus your goal should be to make your characters feel like people the audience knows or could know, and then put them into scenarios that feel similar enough to real life as to still feel familiar despite their details. I mean, Konosuba is just one long allegory for being the only competent person on a group project. And honestly, I could harp on about more examples, but after writing that one sentence, I felt like I had so perfectly summarized the experience that I'm not gonna bother. As for character writing, in this case, there's nothing wrong with leaning into the tropes. In terms of writing an ensemble cast, there's a good reason people still compare themselves to what Seinfeld or Golden Girls character they are. Every friend group tends to have at least one of each of these tropes, and it's easy to replace a character with someone you know and go, oh yeah, Eric would totally do that. That's what makes Konosuba work. Alternatively, the comedy shtick of a straight man and a stooge has existed since the start of comedy for good reason. It works. In an isekai, you even have a perfect setup where the protagonist can be the straight man as he reacts to all the bizarre things in the new world, or the stooge as he goes around and makes an idiot of himself while someone else has to clean up his mess. Let's take another look at my own example. Dan stood over him and offered a hand to pull Eddie up.
Relax, dude. This new life is gonna be sick. I don't think we should plan on dying again anytime soon.
Eddie smacked Dan's hand away.
Stop saying that shit. This is a medieval world. They probably don't even have showers. We'll die from dysentery before a dragon even gets a chance to eat us. If dragons are even real here.
Dude, they probably have, like, healing magic or potions or some shit like that. Plus, no showers means public bathhouses, which means mixed baths.
Dan raised his eyebrows and pointed at his annoyed best friend as he stood up. Now back to Dan's height, Eddie started to yell again.
What's your plan here? You only know how to do 3 things, and there's no video games for you to waste hours on, no movies to watch while high, and no internet to watch porn on. You're gonna die of boredom by tomorrow.
We'll just go on adventures. We're in a world of magic and fantasy.
Dan exclaimed, still no excitement lost.
Daniel, allow me to put our situation in perspective with some simple questions. Have you ever gone camping?
A few times as a kid, but my mom made us stop when I got poison ivy once.
You ever killed anything?
Just bugs and maybe a fish. But I swear I left that tank lid on.
Dan pointed with confidence at his assertion.
Have you ever fought a goblin, Daniel?
Eddie made sure to emphasize this point with an exaggerated arm gesture. Dan squinted as if giving the question real thought.
Well, there was that short guy at the bar the other night.
Wait, Wait, did you try and have a bar fight with a dwarf?
Eddie's anger was immediately replaced with confusion.
No, not that kind of short. He was like 5'2".
Oh, that's fine then. Did you win?
God, no. He kicked my ass so hard I'm pretty sure the bruises followed me into this world.
Then I rest my case.
We can see this very dynamic as Dan plays the boisterous stooge, excited for their new life and home. And Eddie has to respond as the straight man, scared about what's happened and how the two are going to continue on. Dan inflates the situation into a near absurd portrayal of how someone might act after getting isekai'd, while Eddie forces a more grounded and realistic outlook at the situation at hand. Neither are wrong, and the audience can easily see themselves in either character, since an average person would likely be excited to live a life of high fantasy and adventure, but also soon come to realize that modern life has not prepared them for it. Isekai is often seen as escapism, and that's why normal isekai tend to lean into having overpowered main characters. Typical isekai provide an empty vessel for the reader to place themselves in and relish the idea of being universally loved or powerful enough to fix all of their problems with the world. But that doesn't work in comedy, as comedy is derived from strife. We use jokes as a way to cope with our situations and realize that others experience the same things that we do. That can't happen if the person that I'm supposed to relate to can point a finger and blow up a mountain. Which brings us to our next point. Let me give you a little equation here. OP equals NP equals NP. Overpowered means no problem, means no point. A story still needs tension and drama to function, no matter how low the stakes. And by extension, as we've already pointed out, so does comedy. When you have an overpowered character that everyone loves so much and wants to fuck cause he's so cool, it means that there will never be any tension to push the scene or story forward cause they can handle everything without any trouble.
Good grief. When someone's that all-powerful, it's just exasperating.
If you know that, then why put it in your story? With comedy, there must always be a butt of the joke. That's just how comedy works. Someone is always going to look like a fool. The issue with having an overpowered protagonist in this setup is very simple. If the protagonist makes someone else look like a fool, they look like an ass. Once someone is so much more powerful than the person they're joking on, it ceases to be comedy and becomes cruelty. If you want to see this in action, just watch Cautious Hero, a show that derives a majority of its comedy from having an unbelievably powerful man be unbelievably cruel to his entire team and all those around him, like someone intentionally picking all the rude dialogue options in a video game. Even Superman stories know this, and thus try to focus on what Superman can't do, or what he's limited to doing due to his human nature. Despite all that power, he knows he can't do everything, and that he can't save everyone. What does he owe the people of the world, and how much can he give before he has to think about what he owes himself and those that he cares about? That's how you're supposed to handle an OP character. That's not to say that a comedy can't make an overpowered protagonist work. One Punch Man and Mob Psycho both make this work very well. I don't want to harp on them for too long since they're not isekai, but if you look at either one, you can instantly see what makes these work compared to our isekai examples. Despite their overwhelming strength, Mob and Saitama are both just normal dudes with real personalities. Which brings us back to our point on relatability. In fact, they're pretty much the only normal ones in their stories. What makes these two work alongside Kazuma, Eddie and Dan, and even Kemono Michi's OP Genjo is that they all have actual personalities. They're not just the joyous blank slates that most wish fulfillment anime can get away with. They're distinct characters in their own story, and thus can act in ways that are funny first and foremost, instead of needing to rely on being a self-insert. When the OP character is trying to be a self-insert, they instantly lose the ability to do anything that the reader might not do, and forces them into a naturally less funny role, since the creator can't do crazy things with them outside of the single joke of they're strong, no matter what form that joke takes. All of this doesn't only affect your comedy, however. The lack of jokes and how you use your humor can greatly hinder the overarching plot. Jokes are still part of the story. Gags, witty comments, drawn out bits, or full episode arcs, all of these still need to lend something to the overall experience, by either pushing the story forward or providing insights into the characters and their relationships, even if it's only a small amount. No joke should ever feel pointless or like a waste of time. Take, for example, the pizza delivery bike joke in Isekai'd that I mentioned earlier. There is no reason for that joke to be there, as it has no bearing on the rest of the plot. It's just superfluous detail that makes you question why it was there at all. The issue that most isekai run into with this point is something that we referred to earlier. If you start with only one joke, I can't assume you'll have too many more down the line. To further elaborate on this, I'd like to point to The Problem with Isekai by Mood on TV. In the video, Mood speaks on the wider isekai genre and how it has become a very accessible genre for amateur writers, since you can't get the facts wrong if it's not our world, thus allowing anyone to write a historical fiction without worrying about actual research or historical limitations. But because of this fact, the genre is inundated with a million authors trying to make their own stories, and thus it has become near impossible to find genuinely good stories from the dredge of mediocre isekai. He eventually moves on to a set of rules he's devised for whether or not you should care about an isekai at a glance. And while some of these can be argued against, like how the descriptive names are actually meant to act more as a sales pitch to those browsing web novel sites and not for search optimization, his third point is what is useful for our argument.
Thirdly, does it have one thing that separates it from the rest of the isekai shows? In that case, it has a huge chance of falling into the more standard isekai storyline later on, when they can't think of anything new to do with that specific item.
When starting a bog standard isekai, but this time he has/does/is X, and running with that as your premise, that joke will never be able to carry a story past the introduction, if even that. Now I suppose you could argue here that, oh, it does push the story forward because Mamako is so strong that she wins every fight, or Toya's phone tells him how to make ice cream, or whatever. Technically, you'd be right. But do you want to be? Be honest with yourself. Is that what you want from your stories? Easy outs and any percent speedruns for any trouble that comes your hero's way? Actually, make a note here, speedrunner isekai is not that bad of an idea. Jokes for the sake of having jokes are useless and should always be cut. If they say nothing about the characters or add nothing to the ongoing plot, they're bad jokes and a waste of the viewer's time. For a wild example of what I mean, let's look at Full Dive, where a plot and character crucial element is the main character peeing in his pants twice. They could just make him pee once and be done with that after he changes his pants. Most shows would stop there. But no, Full Dive has our hero, do so right before getting his leg amputated in a torture scene, and then reveals that this actually unlocks a secret way out of the encounter, but also causes the sadistic Inquisitioner to then stalk him endlessly because she now loves the idea of torturing him more so he'll wet the bed more. The game even gives him special titles for it, and the stench of his piss pants are a consistent plot point for the next few episodes. Additionally, we learn that the big accident that made him stop running track, that you likely assumed was an injury because that's the typical trope, is the fact that he face-planted during an important race and peed himself on the track in front of his childhood idol. Subversion! But also hilarious ways of driving the plot and characterization of our protagonist. But to fully make my point, I think we should tackle how this can and should actually be used the other way around. A good example of this is implicit in the genre itself. Isekai means another world, aka different from ours. Now you could be a boring bitch and just make your world, oh, it's just like Dragon Quest or some MMO, and bore everyone, or you could actually make it unique and interesting. If you spend the time to make your world unique and interesting, however, you'll probably want to tell people what makes your world so special. And that's the glory of an isekai. Having a protagonist not from that world means you get to have them hear about and experience all the cool things. Though this is not an excuse for you to just tell the audience what's happening. There's a reason that every shitty YouTube critic always harps on movies using exposition. It's the easiest detail to pinpoint as lazy and boring. There is no one, and I mean no one, Who wants to sit there and listen to you explain your in-depth magic system or all the socio-political turmoil that you wrote for your story's background? No matter how cool or unique it may be. Thankfully, in comedy, we have easy ways around this. Let's use another of my own examples.
Dan let out a long groan of annoyance.
Dude, I keep telling you, we'll just use magic or something. We got Isekai'd. There's gotta be some kind of crazy power that we got.
You don't know anything about this world. What makes you so sure there's magic or that we could even use it?
Eddie's frustration instantly returned. Dan looked indignant to Eddie's complaints. Turning to his side and waving at a woman passing by the entrance to the alley, Dan called out,
Hey ma'am, can I ask you a quick question?
The woman stopped and gave a trepidatious glare to the two oddly dressed men with unfamiliar accents. I suppose?
Is there magic in this world?
Dan asked bluntly. The woman looked around before responding. Yes? Her response sounded confidently unsure. Dan looked up and thought for a moment.
Just to make sure. Do you mean like general, oh, the world is full of magic and nature is so beautiful? Or like, there are wizards shooting fire and lightning out of their hands?
The latter, she responded. Dan gave a thumbs up.
Thanks, that's all I needed.
The woman nodded and walked away with her confusion.
See? Magic is really here. Maybe we can do it too. Fireball!
What the hell?
Eddie dodged to the right and slapped away the hand that had been pointed straight at him.
What if that had worked? You could have burned me to death. What would you have done if I'd been burned to a crisp?
Dan solemnly closed his eyes.
I would have mourned your untimely second death and then gone to bank some hot elf babes in your honor.
Eddie let out a sharp exhale as his jaw started to stick out. He took another few breaths and walked off before he re-killed the dumbass that had unfortunately been sent to this new world with him.
Ed, where are you going?
Dan called after the man furiously striding away.
To do literally anything about our situation.
In this scene, we got to learn many things about our protagonists, the world they found themselves in, and give them a new quest. First off, we learn that Dan is far more careless than it initially seems, as he risks shooting a fireball directly at his best friend. Eddie, on the other hand, is revealed to be a man of action and typically is the one to get the pair out of trouble, despite his paranoia and anxieties. As for the world, the woman's reaction to the men confirms that our boys are far from normal for this land they found themselves in. Additionally, she confirms that there is classical magic with spells, and Eddie's action confirms that either not everyone has it, or it's not as simple as just saying the name of the spell. With all of this in mind, the two set off with a primary goal of figuring out how they're going to survive, and a sub-goal of discovering whether or not they have magic abilities to aid them in their adventure. Throughout the whole scene, every joke, bit, and comment served a purpose in helping expand your view of the world, helped you understand what kind of characters Dan and Eddie are, and push the plot forwards. Comedy is a tool to help escalate the story, not cut off its limbs. For example, if your overpowered protagonist keeps mashing every obstacle into a pulp, your plot will continually hit screeching halts and force you to try and pick up speed again, leading into an experience that feels slow and awkward. And now that we've finally hit the end of this journey, I'd like to clarify one last time that I am not saying that all isekai are bad. I am not saying that there can't be good comedy isekai. Obviously, because I mentioned a few. Nor do I think that the shows I pointed out as flawed are completely without humor. Except for Pizzakai and Isekai Smartphone, I have nothing positive to say about those. Comedy is hard to get right, let alone perfect. Take Natsume Akatsuki. He clearly knows how to make good character ensembles, and you can see that carry over into his other stories that aren't Konosuba. The trouble in those, though, is that both lean a little too hard into the one-note character jokes. Kazuma was more than just a sleazeball, but 6 isn't. I'll even admit, though, that I rather like the 3 volumes of Combatants Will Be Dispatched that I read, but watched that anime without sensing even a hint of humor. This could lead into arguments about animation and acting, but I'm not an animator and I'm not really an actor either, so I'm just gonna stick to the writing criticism. If you like the shows I mocked, good for you. Truly like what you want. Hell, I still want a Mamako figure. I already said that comedy is subjective, and I am not here to take anyone's fun away from them. Just because I could spend an hour talking about how The Big Bang Theory is objectively a failure of comedy, that's not gonna stop it from being the most popular show on television. All I ask is that you go out and keep these in mind next time an isekai comedy airs and you find it hilarious or absolutely terrible. Remember, a lot of effort goes into the best comedies, and the people writing them put in a lot of care and effort to making sure those punchlines hit. Or maybe I'm just an ass. It might be both. It's probably both.